I believe the true role of a mentor is to make sure that their apprentice fails, and fails often. Great. So you decided to become a mentor. Now what? Are you meant to have every single right answer, to know how to guide your apprentice through every single step of their career, to be able to help them through every single challenging moment and tragedy that life has in store for them? Well, the truth is, I don't think that's the case. In fact, I know that's not the case, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. What exactly is the role of a mentor? And you might actually be surprised by my answer to this, because I believe the true role of a mentor is to make sure that their apprentice fails, and fails often. And then, only then, is it our role to make sure that they know that it is okay to fail. And more than that, it is the fastest route to learning. In the past 5 years, I've been doing a lot of research into education and learning, and the patterns that we might see in all of the different systems of education through time. And there are 3 things that they all have in common, that they share, or at least which the successful ones have shared. 1, there is an educator or a mentor or a person that guides the way. 2, there is a curriculum, a body of knowledge and know-how which the trainee or the apprentice or the student is learning. And finally, there is a method, a structure of pedagogy or teaching that is used to ensure that the trainee or student is absorbing the knowledge procedurally. And so I would like to use this framework as a foundation to help us talk about this idea of what the role of a mentor is. Because distilled to its essence, the role of a mentor is to support education. And it's also to make them fail. In the early 1900s, one of the fathers of psychology, Lev Vygotsky, a Soviet psychologist, introduced a foundational idea that supports a lot of what we know today about education from the perspective of psychology. And he does it using this idea of the zone of proximal development. And it's a great way to understand both the way people learn, but also the things that get in the way of us learning. And so we can think about the process of learning first as starting as a domain of mastered knowledge. And whether you're a child or a practicing professional, we all have our domains of mastered knowledge, the areas where we're comfortable and confident that we're able to succeed, and where we aren't really learning very much that is new. And so I'd like us to think a little bit about the brain in very basic terms, and specifically about how our brain deals with threat. People often know this as the fight or flight response and how it actually affects our brain. You see, there are 3 important parts for us to just highlight for the sake of this discussion. The first is the prefrontal cortex, the part of our brain that essentially separates us from the rest of the animal kingdom. You can almost think about it as our processing engine. And then is the hippocampus, the place where all of our memories and know-how is stored. And finally is the amygdala, our emotional regulation center, the part of our brain that tells us when there is something going wrong. You can almost think about it as a threat detection system. And each of these parts of our brain interact with one another as we go through the day. And specifically, the amygdala is a part of our brain that is responsible for kicking off the fight or flight response, so that when there is danger, it arrests control of our brain and our body to ensure that we can survive. And we can call this the amygdala hijack. And there are a lot of smarter people than I who get into a lot more detail about this. For the sake of this discussion, even just that knowledge is basic enough. Our emotional regulation center takes control when we are at risk. Now, why is this important? Well, if we think back to the diagram that we were looking at, the zone of proximal development, that area of mastered knowledge, well, that's where our prefrontal cortex is in control, when our processing unit can take its time to solve the problems at hand, and we know that we are in a safe place. But then, when there is a threat, when there is a risk, and sometimes that risk doesn't come in the form of a client, but instead it is a large room of people who you need to speak in front of, it is the review of a boss, essentially anything that threatens us in any kind of a way, whether that's physical or from a psychological perspective. So when we're doing activities that keep us in our domain of mastered knowledge, our prefrontal cortex is in control, and we can process complex things. Our hippocampus is easy to access, both in terms of recalling memories as well as storing them. But as soon as we step outside of that area of competence and we're in the risky zone where we don't really know what to do or how to succeed, that amygdala hijack can very easily take over, and suddenly we're unable to tap into our hippocampus to reach past memories or store new ones. We aren't really capable of processing new challenges. Instead, we tap into our lizard brain, that instinctual aspect of our biology that gets us away from the predator. Now, in the context of running away from a tiger, this is fantastic and this is super useful. But in the context of writing a test, learning a new skill, or performing a prepared speech, that's not useful. In fact, it gets in the way of our success. And so there is always this question of mediating the middle ground. And so to better understand how that actually happens, it's important to understand exactly how stress and arousal of this kind regulates our performance and behavior. And there's another idea from the domain of psychology that is fundamental to understanding the way that people learn. And it's introduced by Robert Yerkes and John Dodson, two psychologists that posed this idea that performance and pressure have actually got a very important relationship. At first, when there is absolutely no pressure, we are actually bored. And we see this very often when you're either in a class that is too easy or given a task that is monotonous and doesn't actually spark your mind. And we kind of are in this first stage of bore out. And we're in this stage, what you can almost think about, too bored to perform. And slowly as pressure arises, as the task gets more challenging, our performance increases. And it increases and increases. And the more pressure there is, and the more arousal that we experience, the higher our performance goes. You can think of a very intense sports match, or a truly challenging riddle, or simply anything that is really sparking your mind and requires you to give absolutely everything in order to succeed. And eventually you reach this peak where you're at your best performance, and that is the ideal zone for learning. That is the space where you are absolutely at your best, and you enter that state that is often called flow. And in this state, you're both performing your best, you're learning your best, and you generally want to be in that domain as much as possible. But the problem is, if that pressure, if that arousal, if that stress continues to increase, your performance starts to dip. And at first, you don't even realize your performance is dipping. I mean, every person that eventually goes through burnout first goes through a couple of stages of denial until they're absolutely unable to do anything, which is when the pressure just gets too much and they begin to burn out. Essentially, Vygotsky teaches us that beyond the domain of mastered knowledge, that balance between order and chaos is where we learn the best. Now, as you can see in this diagram, and I don't at all pretend that it is drawn to scale, the domain in which is ideal for learning is quite small. But what if we could expand that circle? What if we could ensure that every person spends the majority of their time in that domain between what they know how to do and what they don't yet know how to do? And Vygotsky tells us that this is the zone of proximal development, the area of knowledge which we can't do by ourselves, but with the right help, with the right support, we can stretch ourselves to pick up that new skill. But how exactly do we do this? Well, that's where you come in. But the question is, how can we do this? How can we find someone who can expand that zone of proximal development? You see, Vygotsky talks about this idea of the more knowledgeable other, a person who is able to expand that zone of proximal development by ensuring that even when we're doing something we don't entirely know how to do, they are able to support us and guide us through the dangerous and risky waters to ensure that we can continue to push ourselves beyond our current capabilities and do things where we will most probably fail, but we will definitely learn something new. And the longer we can stay in this domain, the faster we grow, the more confident we get in our abilities, and the better off we are, both from a professional perspective, from the perspective of personal fulfillment, and simply from the perspective of growth and understanding. And this is our role as mentors. And so, as we mentioned at the beginning, every single system of learning relies on these three pillars. But most important for our conversation today is that of the mentor, because we've now seen how exactly a mentor contributes to the growth and learning of a mentee. By creating that domain of safety, we expand their zone of proximal development. But it begs the question, how exactly do we expand that zone of safety? And so I'd like to share with you three key responsibilities that a mentor has in the process of working with a mentee. The first is to create safety, specifically with the intention of making it safe to try and fail. And the reason for that is it allows us to not steal our apprentices' problem from them, but allow them to learn how to build the skills themselves that'll let them conquer the challenge at hand. And so in terms of mastered knowledge, our focus is to help them to build confidence in their current existing capabilities. In that domain of ideal learning, we want to allow them to feel safe to fail. And in the area that is beyond their capabilities, we want to create safety so that they can trust us to step out into the domain of the unknown. The second core contribution that a mentor provides is to lead with questions. You see, it's tempting to think about a mentor as this undercover Yoda that just brings the perfect words of wisdom at the turnkey moment of the story. But that's not the case. A true mentor leaves the apprentice room to grow for themselves. And they do that by leading with questions. In the domains that are beyond their current capability, there are one of two things that we're always going to want to be doing. When they're in that domain of growth, when they're pushing themselves beyond their current capability, we want to ask questions, because a question draws out the potential of the mentee, of the apprentice, because it doesn't give them the answer, but it guides them in the right direction of where to look. And by asking the right questions, we allow them to build that knowledge for themselves and slowly grow their sense of confidence. And it is only when we are too far out of their current capabilities that we look for things like giving advice and solving a problem on their behalf. And this is how we actually foster the sense of safety, because they can always know that if things get too far out of hand, we will be there to step in, or at least to point them in the right direction of how to solve it specifically. And by doing that, we both foster a sense of safety, so that they always know that we have their back, but at the same time, they also know that we are never going to solve a problem that they can solve for themselves. And the third and final element, which I derived mostly from the domain of dialectic behavioral therapy, is centered around how to actually deal with challenges. Because the truth is, you're not always going to immediately know when you have stepped outside of the zone of proximal development into that area of risk. And so what we want to do, like a good therapist or psychologist, we want to help the individual who we are working with first take on a new challenge and get to understand it. And sometimes they'll be able to do it and will realize that it's in the domain of mastered knowledge. Sometimes they won't be able to do it, but with a little bit of stretching, they will be able to overcome that challenge. But every now and then, you'll get a challenge that is so big and hairy that they will not be able to deal with it on their own. And in that case, what we do as a mentor is first create the domain of safety. So maybe we have to first step in, but then we want to help them deconstruct the problem into its individual constituting parts and take it on piece by piece, because it is insufficient to solve the problem on their behalf. That is only to protect them and to create the safety and space to break the problem down into manageable pieces. And by allowing them to take on each of the manageable pieces and deal with them individually, they build the intellectual framework, the infrastructure needed to know how to deal with the bigger problem in the future on their own. And it is in doing that that we grow their sense of confidence and their areas of competence by giving them both the space to build new skills, but the support to deal with new challenges that might be outside of their domain of competence. And with these three key elements, we are able to be the support system that every apprentice, every student, every mentee needs. And so, just to recap, the three gears of a mentor, the three ways you support the person that you're working with, is one, to create safety, to allow for failure, to make failure an expectation and a part of the process of learning. Two, is to lead with questions, to encourage autonomy. And that will be a fundamental part when we get to talking about motivation and how to generate intrinsic motivation. And finally, we want to ensure that when a problem is too big, that we work with the mentee to deconstruct the problem into manageable pieces so that one by one, they can create their own tools and infrastructure to be able to deal with that same problem in the future. And if we can do this, we can be the more knowledgeable other without having to know the answer to every question and the right career advice to give at every point in their journey. And so, that's it for today. And next time, we'll be talking about what to do at your very first mentorship meeting. But until then, please like, subscribe, share to anybody that you know that's thinking about becoming a mentor. And more than that, I hope to see you next time.